Thank you for staying with us on Channel 4 for our post-debate coverage following the CBS News vice presidential debate between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. Over the next few minutes here, we're going to bring you some analysis from our roundtable of local political experts.
We are joined by News4JAX political analyst Rick Mullaney, the executive director of the Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute, Chris Hand, a government law attorney and former chief of staff for the city of Jacksonville, who also served as an aide to the late Senator Bob Graham, and Dr. John Newman, a local pastor and political contributor. All right, what are your first thoughts? Do I duck? Are they positive? Have at it.
I think that they both had similar, yet different missions tonight. I think J.D. had to prove that because he's going to be next to a 78-year-old president, if Trump were to win, that he could govern and handle it. Also, he had to increase his unfavorables. So I think a lot of congeniality because of that. I think on the other side of the occasion, that Walz had to also show that he could master the issues, and also that Kamala did a wonderful job in picking him in case something were to happen to her. They both had similar yet different.
Do you think they succeeded?
I think they did, actually.
Yeah. And we definitely want first thoughts from each of you. Chris?
Well, I mean, vice presidential candidates have a very straightforward mission in these debates. Step one, praise your presidential nominee and support their programs. Step two, draw contrast with the other presidential nominee. So we, of course, saw a lot of that from both Governor Walz and Senator Vance tonight. But I think we also saw something different from some recent political debates. They found some areas of agreement. It was much more substantive. They actually talked about policy. Now, people can debate whether what people said were accurate or not accurate, or whether they agree or disagree. But it tended to focus more on those issues and less on some of the personal attacks that we've seen in previous debates. So in that sense, probably elevated. The question is going to be, did it actually make a difference in the election? There was a really palpable sense after the June debate that made a difference, and maybe one after the September presidential debate. With this one, I think probably less likely to make a difference in the polls come November.
Yeah, thank you. Rick?
Well, you know, Kent, I think this year this is the 8th national debate. 5 in the Republican primary, 2 presidential debates, and now this one. That's 8. I believe this is the best of the 8. There was more policy, there was more substance, it was more civil, and I think they were both pretty strategic. One of the things I was keeping an eye on was, would Walz go after Vance? Would Vance go after Walz? Instead, they both very smartly went after the top of the ticket. And you saw Vance go after Kamala Harris, and you saw Walz go after Donald Trump. I think Vance had a very good night, and he advanced his cause. I think Walz was very well prepared, and on several issues such as abortion, health care, January 6th, he did very, very well. But thematically, you saw throughout the night that Vance was being more personal. I think he became more likable than some may have suspected, but he also pivoted to stay on message. And his message was, look at the Donald Trump record, which he constantly went back to over his 4 years, and he tried to keep tying Kamala Harris to the Biden record. I thought both were very well prepared. It was a very well done debate. Quite frankly, it was not as contentious as I thought it would be. It was spirited at times, but I thought one of the better debates, if not the best debate we've seen this year.
Yeah, and so, Chris, let's come back across the table to you. You kind of brought up that message of there was some civility here that Rick is talking about there. Are there any negatives to that? Because clearly the people at the top of the ticket last month when they debated couldn't seem to do that, and here was the substance that you just referenced.
Well, in general for the electorate, are there any negatives to civility? No. I mean, we want voters want candidates to be able to have substantive debates where they talk about the issues that are important to their lives. And remember, the history of vice presidential debates, Kent, is that they typically don't move the needle. What they really are opportunities for vice presidential candidates to, push forward their tickets' messaging on key issues and draw contrast with the other tickets. So in that sense, this vice presidential debate was very much like others that we have seen in past campaigns, where the two candidates were very focused on driving their positive messaging and driving contrast with the other ticket. That's a formula we see in these debates, and again, a formula we saw tonight.
Yeah, and John, I think you referenced this was before we came out, that each candidate was kind of working, I think you pointed to J.D. Vance, working against the unfavorables. Was he trying to create that impression by being conciliatory on certain points?
I really think so, Kent. I think that he was trying to show that he was not the jerk a lot of folks were portraying him to be. And he also had to, at the same time, be loyal to that audience of one, Donald Trump, in trying to go after Walz at the same time. I think he actually walked that pretty well, to be honest with you. I think he was able to show that he was congenial that oftentimes you'd hear him say, I agree with what you just said, Governor. And I think that people, particularly the persuadables, that sliver, who are not really interested in the vitriol, I think they probably saw what they wanted to see from him, also Walz as well.
Did it surprise you at all, out of the bat? I mean, last debate, the presidential debate, we talked economy. That was the biggest topic. Here, we started off with Iran and Israel, then went to Hurricane Helene. Economy didn't come until, what, half hour in?
Yeah.
Was that a good order of things?
I think it was expected because what happened with Israel and Iran today, the bombing from Iran is so dramatic and so significant and where we are that I thought you were going to have both candidates address that. And so it was no surprise. And then, of course, they talked about the hurricane. But I want to be clear, if you missed the debate and you think this was a love fest, it was not. They threw punches. They were very clear. I mean, Walz gave it to Donald Trump, and make no mistake, Vance gave it to Kamala Harris. And I thought that both of them did a pretty good job of staying on message. For Vance in particular, he did something that Donald Trump did not do, and that was he was disciplined enough to stay on message. And his message was constantly going back to immigration, it was going back to energy, it was going back to the Donald Trump record, and it was tying Kamala Harris to Biden. For Walz, this format I don't think is as favorable to him because he's sort of this connect with you kind of person, very folksy. This was a little bit of a different format, but he was very well prepared. And on many of the substantive issues, like particularly abortion and healthcare, which is in his wheelhouse, he did very, very well and I think had the edge. Overall, I thought they both performed very well. But I think for the American people who didn't know these candidates, who got introduced for the first time, Walz came in with a greater favorability rating. I'd be surprised if this doesn't boost Vance to some extent. But I'll go to Chris's point. Is it going to move the needle? I'm not so sure.
No. We're going to keep talking about this. We're going to take a quick break, though, and then come back for our roundtable on the VP debate.
Welcome back as we continue our discussion about the vice presidential debate that you were just listening to. So many topics to talk about here that we are going to continue this into the 11 o'clock newscast as we're getting ready to run out of time here at 10.
Yeah, the debate went a little longer than planned, but right at the top of our 11 o'clock newscast, we're going to have these gentlemen with us for more analysis. And those main topics, they did talk about the war in the Middle East that we're just talking. They used that first: climate change, immigration, southern border, the economy, reproductive rights, gun legislation, all of that. We're going to hear more about that and get some opinions when we come back here in just a few moments.
All right. Thank you for joining us. Stick with us. We are back right after this break.
Right now at 11, our coverage of the first and likely only vice presidential debate of 2024 continues as we dig into the key issues that took center stage tonight. You watch the CBS News debate simulcast right here on News4JAX.
Ohio Senator J.D. Vance and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz started by talking about the Middle East and how the nation should address issues like immigration, inflation, abortion rights. They also explained they would reduce gun violence in schools.
We have to increase security in our schools. We have to make the doors lock better. We have to make the doors stronger. We've got to make the windows stronger. And of course, we've got to increase school resource officers, because the idea that we can magically wave a wand and take guns out of the hands of bad guys, it just doesn't fit with recent experience. So we've got to make our schools safer. And I think we've got to have some common sense bipartisan solutions for how to do that.
That's not far enough when we know there are things that work. I've spent time in Finland and seen some Finnish schools. They don't have this happen, even though they have a high gun ownership rate in the country. There are reasonable things that we can do to make a difference. It's not infringing on your Second Amendment. And the idea to have some of these weapons out there, it just doesn't make any sense. Kamala Harris, as an attorney general, worked on this issue. She knows that it's there. No one's trying to scaremonger and say we're taking your guns, but I ask all of you out there, do you want your schools hardened to look like a fort? Is that what we have to go when we know there's countries around the world that their children aren't practicing these types of drills?
Joining us again, our roundtable of local political experts. We have Rick Mullaney, John Newman, Chris Hand.
And so as we come back to this, Chris, let's start with you. Topics that stood out tonight. What was maybe the most important discussion point?
Well, there was, interestingly, a number of topics where they almost said they agreed with each other and had some common ground. But I think there were several. There was a very clear contrast. One was the issue of abortion, reproductive rights, very different positions on that. Immigration, another one that's been a key issue for the Trump-Vance ticket, but Governor Walz pushing back, talking about legislation that could have passed Congress, but for former President Trump wanting it to, stall before he became president. And also the issue of democracy, January 6th. That was obviously a big flashpoint between the two candidates as well. So those were the issues, maybe healthcare also. Those were some of the issues where we saw the greatest contrast, the clearest difference between the two tickets. And I think as a result, those stood out the most in the debate tonight.
Very polite, I thought.
Not a bad thing, right?
It was refreshing. Pastor Newman, a lot of people already decided how they're going to vote. Do you think anything that was said tonight or the performance that was given tonight may have swayed some of the undecideds?
I heard someone earlier today talk about he was watching the debate tonight because he wanted to make sure that, particularly in Tim Walz's case, that he could take over if something happened to Kamala. So I think he actually did that. For those who were concerned about Trump and his age and so forth and so on, I think JD probably did that as well. But I really think that what was important tonight was those topics that we brought up a minute ago. And what kind of bothered me a little bit was that every time that JD wanted to talk about an issue, he had to go back, and you mentioned it, Rick, talk about Kamala. And some of the stuff he said just kind of bugged me a little bit, particularly when he talked about guns and the illegals coming in and making that the issue. When, look at all those child murderers in schools, those were not illegal guns, they were legally purchased. I thought that was just a step too far for me. That kind of bothered me a lot.
Thank you. Rick, what about you? Something that stood out in terms of the topic or the discussion tonight and whether or not it made a difference to voters who are watching?
Well, what Chris really outlined the issues really well, and that's the big topic. But what stood out to me was the strategy on both sides. And I thought J.D. Vance in particular did something that Donald Trump really was ineffective at doing, and that was to staying on a message. And part of his message was, we don't have to speculate about what Donald Trump's going to do. Look at his 4 years as president. And he repeated, he talked about inflation. He quoted it at 1.5%. He talked about having peace around the world. In fact, at one time in the debate, he said, name the one time there wasn't international conflict. And he talked about, inflation, gas prices, peace, the border. So he was and he came back to that theme. The other theme, and this I know may have irritated John a little bit, but the other theme was Donald Trump tried to do this in his closing argument in the first debate, but Vance made it a theme to try to tie Kamala Harris to the last 3.5 years. And many times, whenever you'd see Walz saying, here's what we're going to do in the future, he would come back with the rebuttal, why haven't we done it already? For Walz, I thought he got off to a little bit of a slower start, found his footing, but he really hit his stride on the abortion issue, on healthcare, and on the threat to democracy. And he went after Donald Trump, and he quoted a couple times on climate change that he called it a hoax, and on healthcare, when Donald Trump was going to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So I think Walz had some very good moments. But what stood out to me was the strategy on both sides. I think they came in well prepared. I thought it was a very, very good night for J.D. Vance, and I think Walz did very well too. I call this an eye of the beholder debate. If you're on the Democratic side in the eye of the beholder, you saw a lot you liked, and if you're on the Republican side with Vance, you saw a lot you liked.
We did hear, though, both of them were called out by each other, the moderators, about inconsistencies with past statements that they had made. What about weak points? Did any of those surface tonight, do you feel?
Well, I mean, I think again, the challenge with being the vice presidential candidate is you're not fully in control of this process. I mean, what sort of voters tend to focus on is the top of the ticket. So you also inherit the strengths and weaknesses of the top of the ticket as well. And I think we saw that tonight. For example, at one point, Governor Walz turned to J.D. Vance and said, did Donald Trump win the 2020 election? And so that's a weak point for the Trump campaign. On the other hand, to the extent that people are concerned about part of the Biden-Harris record, whether that's on issues of immigration or inflation, Governor Walz, because he was there representing the Democratic ticket, had to answer for that tonight. So I think that's a little bit of a challenge being the vice presidential candidate. Whatever issues exist out there, positive and negative for your particular ticket, you inherit those and have to deal with them in the course of the debate.
John and Rick want to give you a final thought, if you will, if you don't mind. That's your final thought, Chris?
Of course.
We've got about a minute left, so maybe 30 seconds from each of you.
Real quick, I think sometimes we have to really deal with the intellectual dishonesty that takes place. Where was the Mike Pence policy? Where was the Dan Quayle economic policy? Everybody knows the president makes a decision. even though they're the last person in the room, they know they are not the one who makes the decision. That's the president's policy. And so I think there's some intellectual dishonesty there that we need to point
by
out.
blaming the vice president
Yes.
for whatever the argument is.
The election's 35 days away, 5 weeks from today. It's a very close race. I agree with Chris earlier that these typically don't move the needle much, but in a really close race like this, you never know what's going to affect an outcome. Remember, Georgia was a 12,000 vote difference in 2020. Michigan was a 10,000 vote difference back in 2016. Right now, this is coming down to about 7 states in theory, and over 150 to 160 million votes cast, maybe 150,000 matter. So tonight was significant in the sense that this is the last time, apparently, that these figures will be here for this debate, either at the vice presidential level or presidential level, unless Donald Trump changes his mind. So I do give it some significance. We'll have to see where that moves the needle, but I think they both acquitted themselves very, very well. But I think for J.D. Vance, he was a little bit behind coming into this. I thought it was a particularly good night for him.
I got great news for you, by the way. Expect you to be back in 1 month when we can do this on election night, if that's all right.
Thank you all so much for
you.
being here. We
Thank you.
appreciate that insight. A reminder, folks, tonight we have made it easier for you to stay up to date about voter information and key election coverage. Just scan the QR code you see on the screen. It'll take you to our 2024 Voters Guide.